Hello. So first, what I'd love to do is just have each of you go through and tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about each one of your organizations. So Kevin, would you like to start?
Okay, so my name's Kevin Johnson. I'm a general partner at a life science firm called Medicxi. We have both early stage and late stage funds. My background is actually as a freestanding entrepreneur, so I've done my own companies in the past and came to venture capital more or less by accident, but I've been doing it for longer than I was doing the entrepreneurial gig. And yeah, pleased to be here.
Great.
Okay, so Kevin's been far too polite. He is a giant in the field of biotech VC. So, and what was your last deal that you just sold?
Impact. 7 billion. Yeah, okay.
and how much had you invested?
20 million.
Yeah. So just to give you a flavour, we're talking about someone here who's really phenomenally successful entrepreneur and an investor. I'm Kate Bingham. I'm a partner in a group, SV Life Sciences, or SV, we've changed our name, Health Investors now. We do, similar to Kevin in terms of the early stage biotech investing, we too have a later stage fund which is actually listed on the London Stock Exchange, International Biotechnology Trust. And we have a new fund which is the Dementia Discovery Fund, which you will see more about in the summer. And we do everything from early through to late. My role is primarily here in Europe, but obviously I've got partners in the US, so we do quite a lot in the US.
Well, my name is Hermann Hauser. I'm originally Austrian. I did my PhD in physics here and then unexpectedly got involved in the high-tech community. As you know, we have now, I think, 15 or 16 billion-dollar companies in Cambridge. When I started, there were none. And I'm very lucky that 6 of these billion-dollar companies had something to do with me. The most successful one, of course, was ARM, which was sold for 30 billion last year. And one of the ones that I'm proudest of is a company called Solexa, which revolutionized gene sequencing. So we reduced the cost of gene sequencing from $10 million to under $1,000 now. The company was sold to Illumina and is now responsible for 90% of all the gene sequencing in the world. And one of the most exciting new companies that I'm supporting now is a company called Evonetics that has as its objective to do exactly the same thing for gene synthesis. If that works as well as we think it might, it's probably one of the most fundamental events in the history of mankind because, as Max Tegmark points out in his book Life 3.0, it's the time when evolution stops and we actually take control of our hardware as well as our software. The thing that I'm particularly excited about is I think there are 3 technologies that will change our lives over the next 5 to 10 years, not 20 to 30 years. One is, of course, machine learning and artificial intelligence. The other is blockchain and smart contracts. And the third one is synthetic biology. And it's the synthetic biology bit that long term I think will be the most important. At Amadeus, we also do everything from seed to later stage. We do mainly European deals. We're less active in the US. And our specialty is really deep technology. So we really look at breakthroughs that are very fundamental.
Great, thank you, Hermann. So I'm just curious to get the audience involved a little bit. For you, I'd love to know how many of you are thinking about starting a company, just by a show of hands? Quite a lot of you. Okay, great. And how many of you have actually raised funding so far? Okay, a few. But there's many of you that have not yet. And so one of the things that I'd like to start with is to really talk about the funding process, because there are a number of different kind of stages, if you will, of funding. And so I'd love for you to speak a little bit about angel investing versus Series A versus Series B. And since all 3 of you kind of seem to do all of those different stages, and you also are all personally angel investors as well, let's have Kevin, you take angel, and Kate, you'll take Series A, and Hermann, can you take Series B? Does that work?
How do
Sure, I think we ought to
The other way?
that.
Okay, reverse that.
So I used to
Okay.
angel invest. I think
Okay, great.
Hermann's a
Hermann's
hardcore.
currently. Okay,
Yeah.
great. Let's do that. So Hermann, can you tell us a little bit about angel investing and how that decision making is different than venture investing?
Yes, well, we're very lucky here in Cambridge that we've got a very active angel community called Cambridge Angels. There are about, I think, 40 of us now. Kevin is one of them as well. It's an unusual group. You get these angel groups all over the world, but because Cambridge is Cambridge and people have made a little bit of money here, with the exception of the US, I think the Cambridge Angels probably have more firepower than other angel groups, at least in Europe. I think we invest something like 10 or 20 million a year, and in deals that can be up to a couple of millions. A normal angel investment is a few $100,000, and indeed most of the investments that we do make is just a few $100,000. The process is also quite a sort of unique Cambridge one. It's always at a college dinner, and before the college dinner, people will be invited, normally 3 or 4 companies, to pitch. And if they survive these pitches, they have already achieved something, because the way the pitch typically goes is that the guy, the young team gets up there and says, well, this is what we're trying to do. And after the first sentence, the guy in the back row says, no. We've been trying to do this 5 years ago. No, this doesn't work. And if in the interaction, then you realize, if the young people have the energy and the conviction and the story, and they survive that, they normally get the money, because we're actually far too trigger happy. We invest probably in too many companies. However, the returns are very impressive. The returns are better than most venture funds. So we'll continue to do that.
Great.
So when you come to institutional investors, which is what we are, what we look for, so we basically only do therapeutic investing. So the 3 key things that we need to see, or which would be really helpful to see, are causative biology, clear and predictable preclinical models, and a understood path to proof of concept in patients. So those would be the 3 buckets we'd ideally want to see in every deal. Obviously, you don't necessarily see them in every deal, but those are the 3 things that matter. And then overlaid with that, we'd like to get a sense of, well, what's the chemistry or the biological approach to actually addressing that target, that pathway, but the biological insights that are being proposed. And actually, at the beginning, we are relaxed if there's not a team there, because we can help either people from our team, or we can assemble entrepreneurs to help to put that plan together. But the more complete it is, the easier it is to make decisions. We've got quite a lot of examples where we find a space that we like, and we will seed it against some clear milestones to be delivered, which would be, in our view, de-risking and persuasive to allow us to actually invest further. And so the sorts of areas we've invested in recently are immunometabolism, tissue-resident Tregs. So how do you affect the immune response locally in different tissues? We're looking at a big cancer vaccine approach. We're looking at, or we've invested. We've done something looking at elimination of late-stage mature plasma B cells. So trying to address some of the causes of lupus and some of the B cell indications, autoimmune indications. So there'll be certain themes that we think are interesting that we will be willing to seed quite early. But ultimately, we need to be able to, in a 5 or so year time frame, get to that proof of concept on dollars that are reasonable and without it being a very long piece of string. Now, I think the hotter the area, the more likely there will be an earlier exit. But we would plan, nevertheless, to be funding through to that clinical efficacy point, and then we would figure out, well, I'll hand over to Kevin to say what you do after that point.
Well, I was going to take a step back a little bit, because I'm just trying to metabolize what I've seen in terms of the number of people who are trying to start companies. Because it is basically a continuum. I always think it's a bit like a game of snooker. You're setting up your next shot with your current shot. So you don't want to do anything early that screws you if it's successful and you want to do something later down the line. And there are some really weird sources of capital that people have gone to that can actually get in the way for institutional investors because it looks like a mess. And or one big angel. That's a one we see quite a lot. Somebody who's not from the sector bought the story, owns most of the company, and then they want to do an institutional round. Generally, what happens there, I've seen it happen multiple times, is that that individual, while they may know nothing about the area that they're in, still want control of the fate. And we're just not going to go there. We have gone there, and it's been a bad ride. So we tend not to go there. But the thing that I learned, so I've come from that side of the room to this side of the room, and the thing that you just learn a different way of thinking. And what I noticed was that it actually, Kate was talking about it, but it was actually, she was alluding to it, it's the investment model. Rather than the business model. I give a shit about the business model. I care about the investment model. I have to, because that's my job. And so with something that's got a 5-year time horizon, for example, that's really important because I know it's uncomfortable to hear, but if you're talking to an institutional investor, the first thing they're thinking about is, well, who am I going to sell this to? How much is it going to be worth? And am I going to make a return? That's actually... I'm thinking that all the time. Every the time you pause for a paragraph, I'm thinking, okay, how does that affect my exit? Because the real liability for institutional investors is the exit. That's the hard bit, I think. Everything else is fairly straightforward. You can, it's been done before multiple times, but the exit is the hard bit. So I think that's generally what we spend most of our time worrying about. And then in terms of we do very similar to Kate's experience that a lot of the companies that we've invested in, we've actually started. It's somebody in an academic. About 70% of our startups are from academic science. They don't necessarily want to go with the science, but they want to be involved in it. So that's perfectly doable. So we'll put the capabilities around it to make that happen. But I would say that there are two ingredients, rather than being super specific about theme areas. So we tend to be much more opportunistic in our firm. The theme area is you've got to have domain expertise. If we know more about your area than you do, that's really not a good recipe because we don't know enough, or we'd be already doing it. So domain expertise, I think, is the critical ingredient. I don't care whether you've got an MBA. I prefer you don't have one. But the real thing is that you know the science. And then it's the area. One thing that's really comes home to you time and time again is that it's actually far more dependent on what area you're interested in pursuing than anything else. Because we can pretty much fix anything else, but we can't fix the area. So, I would love to do diagnostic companies. I would have a much bigger impact on human healthcare with a good diagnostic play than with a new drug for Alzheimer's. Well, maybe not actually. Maybe something else. Maybe something else. But the actually investment model for diagnostics is terrible, right? The investment model for drugs is very good. We know that will work. So that's why we also invest in therapeutics and we don't invest in other areas. It's because the investment model isn't there. Antibiotics, there really isn't a problem with antibiotic resistance. There's a problem with antibiotic resistance. There isn't a problem with antibiotics. If the business model or the investment model was there for antibiotics, it would be sorted. You would not read anything about it in the papers, right? It's just that it's just not economically viable to come up with new antibiotics. That's the problem. It's a penny a bucket. You're not going to spend $1 billion developing a molecule that sells for a penny a bucket, because it's or a 10% premium on a penny a bucket. So I would say that for whether it's seed, Series A or Series B or beyond, right? The area is really important, as well as what we call the cash distance to exit, and the time to exit. That much more general terms, I think. Sorry, I spoke too long.
No, it's great though. One of the questions that I'm sure that a lot of this audience has is, and that I've gotten from some of the teams that I've coached, is, well, I'm a young entrepreneur, I've never done this before. How is it that I'm going to really deal with that kind of credibility gap that our first speaker was really talking about? And so I'd love for you guys to take a moment to talk about what advice do you have for people that are really new to this? And is that a problem, or is that something that they just have in their head?
I think it's pretty straightforward, because as Kevin said, you've got to, provided you've got your domain expertise and you're an expert in whatever area you're developing your new company, I would encourage you to try and bring in advisors or non-execs on your board who have track records and experience doing whatever you're doing. And so they can be your sounding board, your mentor, your advisor, or visors. And actually that is credible, and they will have the network you would ideally that you seek as you go out to start raising money. And I think you'll find that experienced mentors like that are pretty interested in what young people are doing and are willing to help. I think this conference is testament to that. I mean, there's a lot of phenomenal speakers that show up and support this youth entrepreneurship. And so I would encourage you to find those people and ask them to help.
Yeah, to think back to the first company I did is a company called Cambridge Antibody Technology. And when we started that up, I was doing a postdoc in the pathology department. And I had no credibility at all whatsoever, imagined or real or otherwise, in the antibody engineering space. Yeah. I mean, I'd done some, this was when it was actually still a burgeoning field. And the way we did it was exactly that. So we had a scientific advisory board with 2 Nobel Prize winners on it, because actually Cambridge is really good in the antibody space. So we had Cesar Milstein and Aaron Klug on our scientific advisory board, right? So, and then actually, I remember there was a feature in the Cambridge Evening News, which said that you'd had to have with all of these luminaries in the company, you needed a Nobel Prize to make the tea. But actually, when I read that, I laughed. My first thought was to laugh, and the second thought was actually, yeah, that's pretty good, because we've definitely got some credibility in there that actually we didn't possess. So I think the getting people around you who really are, they don't have to, you're not asking a lot from them, but you are asking for their time, so they've really got to be interested.
And their Rolodex.
Yes, exactly, yes.
In the days, you guys don't know what a Rolodex is.
Contact list.
Actually, I understood immediately what you meant, and then I'm really
phone book
your
list.
contacts list. Yeah.
There you go. Hermann, any advice for young entrepreneurs that are pitching
yes,
for the first time?
I've been doing this for a while, so I sort of boil it down to 3 main things that I'm looking for. One is the size of the opportunity, the size of the market, because unless it's some sort of substantial market that you're addressing, you've got to get everything right in order to win. If it's a very big market, you can make a couple of mistakes and still win. So the size of the opportunity is important. The second thing we look for is the quality of the team. And there we look for at least 1 star. It's often a technical star, but it can be a managerial star, as in the case of 5AI, our autonomous driving company in London. We just have one of the best CEOs in Europe, in Stan Boland, who's actually my last managing director at Acorn, but he's done over $1 billion worth of exits for me since then in various companies. And he's the only person actually in Europe that I know, which when I asked him, Stan, you've done over $1 billion worth of exit for us. That's pretty good for Europe. Do we now want to build a company that's $1 billion itself? And there's 10 billion. Yeah. So you don't normally get that ambition in Europe. If somebody, I don't know if he's going to build a $10 billion company, but the size of the opportunity in autonomous driving certainly is big enough. His talent is amazing. His ability to attract the right people to build the team, because that's really the key thing, is you have to have a star. In my opinion, you have to have a star, because when you have a star, then you can assemble the other people around it because people want to be part of a winning team. And my third criteria, sadly for a propeller head like me, is the technology. Because I've seen so many times that an A team with C technology always beats the C team with A technology. So if you have somebody, a team that's really outstanding, they'll find the technology to solve the problem that they're trying to address. And then, as Kevin and you have already said, surrounding yourself with the right mentors and the right advisors. And again, you've witnessed with the GapSummit that we old folks are actually quite happy to work with young people because it's very exciting to work with new ideas. And I particularly enjoy working with graduate students that haven't been told what's impossible yet, so they just go and do it. So that's all right.
Fantastic. So I have many other questions, but I want to open it up to the audience.
Hi, I'm Dominic. I'm a PhD student here. We've heard over the past 2 days just how many different problems biotech has the opportunity to solve, but as you've mentioned, some of these just aren't economically viable. So do you think there is a role for private companies to solve problems like the health inequalities that you see between the Western world and the more underdeveloped world? Because even if it's not economically viable, then antibiotic resistance could still essentially pose a threat to a global population, not just underdeveloped populations.
Should I take that?
Would I like to take that?
No, I said that. I was asking.
Yeah, please,
okay,
go ahead.
Yeah. So yes, I do. There are many. So remember, we're working within a capitalist business model, a capitalist organization. Even though it's more about venture than it's about capital, it's still about the capital. So it doesn't make any sense for us we can do some things on the edges, but our main line has to be it's going to make a return for our investors, which are pension funds and insurance companies and endowments and whatever. The only reason they're putting money into our funds is because they are going to make a return that's better than putting it into another asset class. But it's very much, it is one asset class. So when it comes to things that don't fit in that model, like antibiotics, like diagnostics, and in fact many, many other areas, then there is an opportunity. I mean, I think you heard the Biocon example, which I happen to know because it's about antibodies and biologics and stuff. I knew a bit about already, where that's actually just trying to solve. That was originally set up to solve a domestic supply issue, right? And if you go into Latin America or Cuba, you'll see the same thing happening again. So there is that opportunity that it starts out as something local and then gets bigger as it's successful locally. But and then there are organisations like the Gates Foundation, which is primarily around these developing country issues, I think. So you can do it, but it is bloody tough because if you're looking at drugs themselves, at least novel drugs, where you've got a very high attrition rate. The reason that the system is set up as it is because it's a very high attrition rate. 90% fail. Unfortunately, a large number fail late on after you've invested a lot in them. And in order to make the whole thing fit as a financial model, then you've really they end up being high priced. There is one other thing, which is my hobby horse, that can be done, and that is society as a whole sets the expectations for new drug entities. It seems to have more impact than it should do, but we couldn't develop paracetamol, ibuprofen, or aspirin now. We wouldn't even get into the clinic with them because they've actually got so paracetamol, liver toxicity, aspirin, gastrointestinal bleeding, for example. Right? We would never even be able to develop those now, and I think that's because as society we've come to expect that things don't have big side effects or anything that is other than extremely rare. all right? We're responsible for that. We as society, I'm just a member of society, so we're responsible for that. So I think, and if you look at there's a load of drugs that have fallen out because of, you know, one person in 1,000 had a really bad problem with them. They're incredibly difficult to try and identify a priori. Incredibly difficult, if not impossible. But that's the consequence. You know, and what happens then is that those failures are baked into the price of the ones that do make it.
I'll just add one other topic, which is vaccines. So actually, I do think biotech plays a role in dealing with health inequality. So if I take an example, Crucell, very successful European-based vaccine company, acquired by J&J for Western world vaccination products initially. And you know, J&J's done a massive, and maybe they've spoken about it at the summit here already, has done a massive investment looking at Zika virus, Ebola, and setting up big vaccine programs so that the world is better prepared for future outbreaks. So I think biotech plays a role, but as Kevin says, the first priority has to be to generate a return, treating patients who can pay and generate proceeds for the investors who funded the products to get there. But I think then the consequences, then you can use them much more broadly and in emerging markets.
But the main thing to point about, just on the J&J point, sorry, Hermann, the point about on the J&J side, that's they view that as largely philanthropic. You know, and actually you see it in the antibiotic divisions in Big Pharma as well. They're not expecting very much from these organizations. They feel they should be doing that as good citizens. Sorry, Sam.
So I do actually have a horse in running in antibiotics, and I suppose that's one of the advantage of a business angel approach, where as long as you can play with small amounts of money, you don't need to have the big returns. It's a local company called FICO, and it uses phages. And I've learned a lot about phages over the 10 years that we're into. It's a very unusual company because it's managed to raise by now 15 million pounds entirely from angels. So we've been supporting this company, you know, through this difficult process of proving phages that really weren't very popular at all, because, you know, phages, you know, you don't want to have those in your body when we actually have 1.5 kilograms of them, because every bacteria has an associated phage population. And the unusual thing that Heather Fairhead, who runs this company, has discovered is that there is a protein called the SAS protein, which you find in spores. So spores, when they get exposed to very high temperatures, as you probably know, DNA denature rises around 70 to 90 degrees, and these spores can survive quite happily with their DNA intact at 120, 150 degrees C. So how do they do this? So there's the SAS protein that wraps itself around the major groove of the DNA and protects it. Now, when this SAS protein, since it's such a generic effect to have that protein, if you express that protein in a bacteria, it shuts down the bacteria, because if you've got that protein in the major groove, it just shuts down the entire biology of the cell, and then the cell just disappears. And the nice thing about that bacteria is that it can't tell, because it doesn't lyse, it can't tell the other bacteria what's happened, so the chance of getting resistance is very low. And the effect is spectacular. You know, normal antibiotics work over hours and days. This has the same effect over half an hour. So the basic mechanism is incredibly powerful, and every bacteria has an associated phage population. And you know, she worked very hard to characterize the phages. They've been sequenced. She now can produce the phages with incredibly high, you know, purity, etc. There's one other thing that makes me hopeful that maybe one can make something of this company, and is because of the poor economics of antibiotics. The FDA has changed the rules, and you can now do a phase 1 and a phase 2 trial with you know, a company that's the size of FICO, so for a few $1 million rather than tens of millions. So there is this opportunity. Just one last remark on the business model. I mean, these two guys are absolute world-class people when it comes to therapeutics. We at Amadeus don't do any therapeutics because we leave it to the experts who do this much better. We actually do the diagnostics investments and these unusual investments. And the reason why I believe that this is the future is I believe that the combination of these powerful machine learning and AI techniques that we know a lot about because we've got lots of investments in that area, with sensors, biosensors that now become available, allows us to understand the world's most complex systems, which is biology and eventually also the brain. The only way that you can do this is by having a very good a set of data, set of training data. And the only way you can get these excellent data sets that you need is with new sensors. You know, they start with these watches, but we'll soon have much better sensors. And I actually believe that long term we'll have sensors that will be subcutaneous to measure maybe a dozen, maybe 24 of the fundamental things that you want to know about the body. And then you can use all these new AI and machine learning techniques to warn people that a disease is about to happen long before it actually happens. So the very fundamental long-term approach that I believe in is that treating people who are ill is actually not where the future is. The future is keeping people healthy, making sure that they never become ill in the first place.
Fantastic.
Hi, thank you guys so much for speaking. My name is Jessica. I'm a grad student over in America. So I actually had some questions related to the VC career path. So Dr. Johnson, as you had mentioned, you guys were all once on this side of the aisle, right? So as a lot of us here are graduate students, what is the split in your career between the business and the science, and what were the critical steps for you to transition into this VC career? First question. And then second one for Dr. Hauser, being a co-founder of a VC company, so you're basically an entrepreneur of VCs for entrepreneurs, right? So how does that process start? What does that look like as opposed to, say, a biotech entrepreneurship venture? Thank you.
You want to
Shall I
start?
do the first bit?
Yeah.
So we get asked this question a lot. There are a number of routes in. Traditionally, it's been people in finance or from a consulting background that have come into venture capital. But increasingly, you're getting people who've been in the space and done their own companies that have come in. So they're more like my phenotype. And for me, it was a complete accident. I never intended to become a VC. It's got such a bad name, the whole field. I just thought there's no goddamn way I'm going to become, I'm going to carry that card.
Did any of you actually intend to become a VC?
There you go. It's
There you go.
interesting. It's interesting, isn't it? So actually, my routine was that I tried to do a company much like the one that Hermann was talking about, which is a spin out of Cambridge Antibody. We developed these multiplex arrays to monitor multiple blood analytes, and the idea was to actually try and resuscitate drugs that had failed in early development. So that was the business model. Completely fell on its arse when I went to talk to VCs. Right, I might even talk to you about it. But basically, it was just it sucked wind. So and in the end, I gave up because you can keep on going, but you've got to know when to say enough. And it clearly wasn't getting any traction at all, and was never going to get any. I actually then, but I talked to a lot of VCs along the way, and actually I thought, actually these guys are quite fun. I went on to had lunch and started hanging out with people I'd met to see what I'd got wrong. Because I didn't understand it, so there's got to be something. I'm missing something somewhere. And actually, in that process, I found out what was wrong. So this is the investment model point. The business model's fine. The investment model sucked. But in doing that, what was really quite interesting is you think you know quite a lot about what's going on as a biotech person, you're doing company, you're going to conferences, you're talking to people all the time. You think you know what's going on. You don't. There's like 2 orders of magnitude more that's going on that you never see because it's coming over the horizon, and that's what made me stay there. But it's far more useful. You are far more useful not only to the firm, but also to the entities you invest in if you've got some operational experience. It's just so much more helpful. And also you can evaluate opportunities much more quickly. I don't have to farm out every opportunity I see to like 5 consultants to say, what do you think about this? Is there an opportunity there? I can make my own mind up on whether I think this looks like it's got legs or not. That is, I think you're going to see that as much more of a trend. I see it much more myself now. And for us, even when we're syndicating with other venture firms like Kate's, it's much, it's much easier to have that dialogue if there are people who actually understand what it takes to do the business, not just from the financial side of it. I think Dave Parrott said this morning, that bit is actually quite straightforward. You can learn that in a morning. So it's not that bit that's the critical bit. It's the bit about the venture that's the critical bit.
So I completely agree with Kevin. I would not recruit me now. So I've been doing this 26 years. I was biochemist, went in consulting, did an MBA, and then joined what was then Schroeder Ventures straight out of that. Now that was a relatively standard path at the time, absolutely. And I've been doing it so long that I now have got enough experience that I can be helpful to companies, but I would not use that as a career path. So getting entrepreneurial experience and operating experience for sure is the right thing. I think there could be a role in a sort of a junior role in VC firms for a bit before you go out and get that deep experience. But frankly, you're not going to be helpful to CEOs and the leadership of portfolio companies unless you can contribute something. And you need to figure out what it is you're going to contribute. And so having been successful or failed, actually, it doesn't particularly matter whether you've been failed or succeeded, but having been in the trenches and have seen how it is to build companies and have learned something that's useful from that, that is helpful.
I didn't know this is another thing that we had in common. I often think about whether I would have invested in myself at Acorn Computers, and I certainly would not. And you wouldn't have hired yourself. So, one thing that went through my mind when I listened to the conversation that we had before the coffee break was there was this person from KPMG talking about knowing your north and knowing your career path and knowing what you want to do, and that's certainly not what happened in my life. So my family was in the wine business in the Tyrol, and after I had finished my PhD in physics, I had a very clear vision that I'd either become a professor in physics or I'll go back and join my father in the wine trade. But what I did is I started Acorn Computers because it was all happening in microprocessors. And I remember very well what our business model was and what our business idea was, which was it's all happening in microprocessors. We'll do something there. And that was it. There was no business plan. There was no... it was also, if I can just tell you the anecdote on how we financed the company, because there was no venture capital, I'm just showing my age here. This was in the late 70s. So we had to get some bank finance. So we went to the local National Westminster Bank, and I said, we need, we just finished my PhD, I want to start a company, I need some money. Would you lend us £10,000? And the guy said, oh, it's jolly good to see these young people start companies. And then he did his due diligence. And he said, I don't know if many of you have seen that big famous clock with the chronophage at King's Parade. That was the entrance to National Westminster Bank, and he had his office there. And his due diligence was, now, which college did you go to? And I could point out of his window and said, that one over there, which was King's College. I said, jolly good, here's £10,000. So that was relationship management in those days. And when I went back a couple of years later and said, it's going really well, because we need $1 million now, he fell off the chair, of course. But we got it from, we changed banks, we ordered from Barclays. And that became ARM, and it became the most successful microprocessor company in the world, outselling Intel 20-1 at the moment. So, we had no ambition or idea that we would ever even produce a microprocessor, which was that microprocessors were an exciting area. Your question was, how did I change from being an entrepreneur? Because at that time, I had already started a few companies to be a venture capitalist. And the answer was sort of very similar. Because I made a bit of money with Acorn Computers, which was the first company in Britain to go from 0 to 100 million pounds revenue in 5 years. It was also the only company that I know of anywhere in the world who's done it on a total, share capital investment of £100. So it's the only company I know of in the world that had a capital gain of 1 millionfold. So every pound that we put in was 100 million when we take it public. So. Because I had a bit of money, I became, as often entrepreneurs do, they then want to help other people to start their companies. So at that time, I think I must have been 50% of the business angel money in Cambridge. And I had a deal flow that I just couldn't manage anymore. And that was the reason why I said, well, I better start a venture capital company. And I was very lucky that I met my partner, Ann Glover, and we decided to start that.
Hi, so you guys were talking about diagnostics and therapeutics, and you mentioned Alzheimer's and chuckled a little bit. What do you guys think about the perspectives of Alzheimer's in the future, and do you think we will ever address this serious unmet need?
So we've got now a dedicated fund called the Dementia Discovery Fund, which is mission. It's a 15-year venture fund, which is kind of unusual, and it's been backed by 7 strategics, and there will be, as I said, more talk about. Bill Gates has come in personally, so that is public. And the goal is to find disease-modifying dementia drugs. So as you know, there are no drugs that actually alter the course of the disease. There are some that will address symptoms for some people for some period of time, but there's nothing that fundamentally changes the course of the disease. There's been lots of issues with the area. The first is the vast majority of all academic and industrial dollars that have been spent has been spent looking at different paths of the amyloid beta pathway. So, and this is the most causal link to Alzheimer's. So there's no question that itself is wrong. It's just, so far, there's been no clinical data that's proved that you can have any disease-modifying effects. Now, part of the issue will be how do you identify the patients and what are the inclusion criteria and what are the studies you're running. And actually, until recently, we didn't have the diagnostic and the imaging tests to actually get the right patients into the study. So some of the big phase 3 failures actually turned out that a third of the patients didn't in fact have Alzheimer's plaques. So if you're treating patients with an anti-amyloid antibody that's designed to clear plaques, and you don't start with plaques, you're not going to get a positive clinical significance in that study. So I'm certainly not suggesting that the amyloid beta pathway intervention is dead, but so far there are still drugs addressing that pathway, but so far there's been nothing that's come through. What we're looking at is basically everything else. So looking at other pathways, other biologies, and other plausible approaches to intervening in what is actually a very large set of different diseases. And we take comfort from the fact that there is a roadmap in oncology which has done exactly this. So if you take cancer 15 years ago, we used to talk about cancer of the organs. They talk about the breast, the colon, the lung. Whereas now, actually, you talk about cancer and the drivers of that disease. So what pathway, what mutation, what impact that change has that has led to the tumour cells developing. And also, there's been a huge revolution in immuno-oncology. So how can you train the body's immune system to actually tackle the disease itself? And if you then apply that to dementia and Alzheimer's, actually there's a lot we can learn. So how do you stratify patients? How do you get to the underlying causes of the disease? And how can you, if you take immuno-oncology, how can you actually stimulate the brain's immune system to actually do its day job? Because if you think about it, this is a disease that typically starts appearing at sort of your 70s, certainly by 80s. So actually, everything's worked for a long time before it starts going wrong. So how can you actually take those erroneous or those dysfunctional mechanisms and try and get them right again. So actually, as part of our fund, we have no shortage of potential investing opportunities. We're not only looking at creating new pathways and new biologies, we're looking at established biologies which are well proven in other indications. And so if it's, for example, to take different anti-inflammatory approaches, actually a lot of those are legitimate for the brain. It's just they've never been tested. Kevin and I and Hermann will never invest in dementia in our core funds as the first indication because it has a failure rate of 100%. So that's a really tough call for a investor who actually wants to make a return to say, you know what, that's going to be our first call. Yet with a fund that is the mission, we can actually take investment bets that we wouldn't do necessarily, and we can then get them to points at which there's a data set that's plausible that then enables more regular investors to come in. So I think huge opportunity. I think if we have this conversation in 5 years' time and 10 years' time, there will be a host of clinical candidates and potentially drugs that are approved that will be disease modifying. And we've got 3 drugs that are coming to the clinic this year. So I think there will be changes, and I think I do it for self-interest as well as society, but I think there will be drugs that will be effective.
Yeah, I completely agree, and Kate's the person to come to if you've got something. There are a couple of reasons why we haven't got anything in that space, and the central nervous system is quite a tough area to be in more generally, not just neurodegeneration. Part of that is the length of clinical studies to show that you have an effect, or to actually proving, if you have something that works, how do you actually prove that in a reasonable timeline? And I'm not talking about doing a 5-year follow-up. That's just, we're not going to do that sort of thing. One of the things but what Kate says about cancer, so cancer used to be a really, almost intractable. You had chemo and that was it. Right? And now look at what cure rates in cancer is just in various cancers are just amazing. HIV, right? HIV was at one point totally bloody unbeatable. You put any selection pressure on that damn thing, a small molecule or an antibody, it would have variants popping up within days. So your therapy would have a lifetime of less than a week, because basically the thing has just so much biotech potential it would just mutate out of your range. But now look at it. It's no longer a death sentence. These things do. Sorry?
Hep C.
Hep C. Cured. Yeah, it's an amazing thing. So stuff does come up. It tends to come up more, though the viral examples are specific, but other things tend up to be opportunistic. You're looking somewhere else and you find something that's relevant in that space. For example, we're focusing. There are 2 things that we're doing that look like they might read on to Alzheimer's dementia. One of them is phagocytosis, debris clearance. Your body's trash clearing mechanism. Turns out you can modulate. It turns out you need to modulate that in lots of different areas. It's cleaning up the mess afterwards. That turns out to be quite an interesting therapeutic push. We're also working on something called parabiosis, which is trying to understand how we age and why we age. That's actually turning out to be quite interesting in multiple things, but also in neurodegeneration. So you'll come at it from more than likely, would be my prediction. I would completely agree, in 5 or 10 years you're going to be looking at something that's completely different to what it is now. It will probably come from left field. It might come from the immunospace, it might come from somewhere else, but it will come from left field.
And I think systems biology will help.
Yes, indeed.
I'd love to get a question that's specifically about the pitch, like the companies that you're pitching, because as many of you have participated over the course of the competition, and you're going to be seeing pitches later today, I'd love to hear a question that's specifically about the company you're pitching, because I know that many of you are asking for funding. And so you have a panel here of experienced entrepreneurs and now VCs that could actually provide real guidance. So who has a question about that?
Hi, my name is Martina Kachma, and I'm a graduate student at UC Irvine. So I'm with one of the teams that is pitching today. And a question that I had was, so as we are young entrepreneurs, we don't have a lot of experience with going to get funding. So what points of advice do you have for us in terms of not getting a bad deal when it comes out to trying to get funding for ourselves?
So my first point is I think that question is wrong. So the mindset of what's your deal is the wrong thing. You should be thinking about how can you get your opportunity funded with the best possible investors who can help you. Actually, the deal will take care of itself, because if you are good and you've got a good team, you will be properly rewarded and looked after. But the idea that it's a sort of a dragon's den and it's, well, I'll give you 50p a share and, well, I'll give you £1 a share, that's just completely the wrong mindset, and I'd just get away from that. It will be great to be successful and get your company funded, and you want to do so with the right investors. Just take the deal out of your vocab, would be my advice.
Yeah, I mean, the deal will take care of itself. The advice I would give, or the advice I would have given myself at that time, is try and think like an investor. You know, it's like you're putting your parents' money into it, or you're putting your money into it. How would you feel about it? You know, what would you want to see that capital do? And how would you assure them that it's not just money down the drain? There is one thing that we do a lot of. Both Kate's firm and my firm, we do seed investing. And the seed investment there is for us, is the killer experiment. So what is it that you really need to see? What does this thing really need to do to have a chance of making it, or making it big? Okay, so in fact, that sort of lexicon is quite a useful frame around your opportunity. You know, how is this money going to give us greater certainty, in other words, reduce the risk, that this thing is going to be successful? That's generally how we look at it. You know, a lot of the work that's coming out of academic labs is, you know, it's sort of tangential to a business thing, because it's been developed for, you know, and you're going to publish it, and you know, it's about a scientific journey and the status of the science and how it's involved and whatever. The business frame is a different one, because then it's how you're going to exploit that, and what are you going to do to exploit it. So that usually requires you to segue across from where you're starting out. And so the killer experiment is to identify, is to try and we get involved in this to divine what the killer experiment is, along with the entrepreneurs. But it's there with a view to increasing the certainty, or removing the certainty altogether that this thing has got legs. So the worst thing I think you could do as an individual is flog a dead horse. That it's going to take you 6 or 7 years to find out whether this thing is viable or not, would be a waste of your lifetime. So for me, it would be, let's see if this thing is going to work, and if it doesn't, kill it and move on to something that will work.
Hi, my name is Sasha, and I'm studying biomedicine at the University of Copenhagen. I was just wondering if, basically what I often hear is when you ask for a job, you shouldn't ask for a job. So I was wondering if it's the same for funding, and whether there's any advice you could give us to stuff we could do that would make the investors come to us, and not the other way around.
Good call. That's a good question.
Who would like to take that?
Yeah, most of the time that's what we do, actually. So I was told a long time. Sorry, I will do it for 45 seconds. There were two sorts of VCs when I joined. There are two sorts of VCs, I was told. There are the hustlers, and then the donut eaters. And the donut eater, the latter category, is you wait for things to come to you, and you eat donuts while somebody's pitching you an idea. The hustlers go out and look for ideas. And more VCs I see are hustlers. So in fact, more of the time, you know, we'll see a publication somewhere, or we'll hear a talk, or somebody in our network will say, there's some really good science going down in Winnipeg, right? You need to get out there. We'll be on a plane, we'll go out there, and we'll find out what it's all about. And then you just work, you just see if there is something there that can nucleate an opportunity and the rest of it we can do, but it's always looking for a really outstanding opportunity. So in fact there are lots of investor types who hustle like that. So just make sure somebody knows about it, or somebody in the network knows about it, and it will come back to one or more of us.
And it will naturally start off with academic publications, and then there will be a whole lot behind that which is unpublished. So you want to make sure that you are part of some red hot new breaking science, and then you'll have people knocking on the door.
Hermann, anything to add on that one?
Just passion. One of the things we're looking for is that you're passionate about what you're doing, because normally in any history of a company, there are periods when it gets really tough, and then people really need to believe in what they're doing. And unless you've got that passion for whatever your objective is, you're not going to get through that.
My name is Celeste. I'm from New Zealand. So we heard about how in Cambridge you guys have such a strong biotech hub. You guys get the opportunity people get the opportunity to pitch to angel investors before dinner and all that. So my question is, for young aspiring entrepreneurs from New Zealand, or for somewhere really far away from such a strong biotech hub, how can we reach you guys? What are the opportunities?
This is easy. I'm in New Zealand every winter, so just pitch to me when I'm down there. Sorry.
What's actually a good answer?
But correct answer.
It's a perfect answer.
Just coming to Cambridge Angels, although it is Cambridge Angels, it will take pitches from anywhere. So you can actually pitch, if you want to come up from New Zealand, but anybody from, and we do get pitches and projects from as far away as London, and even Oxford people have been pitching here. But if there was somebody from Copenhagen or from Milano, we'd be happy to listen to that as well. The other thing to say is that there are a number of high technology hubs and biotechnology hubs appearing in Europe. So it's not just Cambridge and other hubs in the UK, but it's Munich, it's the northern countries. So you just need to see wherever your local hub is to go and pitch if you're out in the sticks.
I mean, there certainly are specialist biotech VCs in Australia. I don't know about New Zealand. So David Phillips, SR1's there. What's his Brandon Capital, the Apex guy?
Sorry, I'm trying. I'm thinking.
Look up Brandon Capital. There's a good guy who used to work here in the UK.
That's right. That's right.
Whose name has escaped me, but
actually, I did an angel investment in an Australian company that was started up by a friend of mine, and the way they did it. So the way that they did it was they used one of the capital markets in Australia and New Zealand aren't that good. So they're a bit of a dead zone. So a lot of companies go public in Australia and they're just the zombie companies because there's nothing to follow on. But they were quite smart about it. They got a lot of government money, so because basically startup they matched funding from the government. I'm pretty sure it's there in New Zealand as well. So you can double your money. But the way they did it in the end is that the difficulty with investing abroad. So we wouldn't have any problem investing in Australia and New Zealand, and I don't think anybody who's really serious about things would, if the opportunity is good enough, and then I don't care where it is. The one time I do care where it is when it comes to exit those things. So all of the local government money, effectively government-backed, to help startups, that's all really good until the point you come to take capital out of the country, right? And then you get screwed. So what will probably have to happen, which is exactly what my mate's company did, is that they actually they put the company in Ireland. The headquarters of the company was an Irish company. It was still operating in Australia. And in fact, they took it, so this was a vet biologics company. So, taking human biologics and then making them for dogs and cats.
Just had a plan on that.
Petize them. Have you?
Yeah.
They've already did it. So it was a company called NextVet.
And Bradley's latest.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, it's actually quite a cool idea. It will work. But they sold it to the Pfizer Animal Health Zoetis, I think. So they took it on NASDAQ. So even though it's an Irish company, they went across the US, and then they sold it to Pfizer's Animal Health unit that was spun out and looking for products.
But I think
it can be done.
I think you're entirely right. There's plenty of models now where you leave research and possibly early D where it's been created, but then you put a sort of commercial C-suite in one of the key markets where they can go out and raise money. So whether that's UK or more likely the US.
Yeah.
And actually from New Zealand, it's not far to go to California, so that's where I'd go.
Yeah. Don't use it as an excuse.
I want to follow up on something that you were talking about, Kevin, which is common pitfalls, like taking money from a large angel investor, that kind of thing. For Kate and for Hermann, what are other common pitfalls that you see people make that you would, given that this is probably their first go-around, that they should know about, so that way they don't make that mistake?
So, a whole bunch of things. To get funded to begin with, as Kevin says, you need to have a plan that has some clear decision points so that you can risk mitigate funds that go in, so that while it's uber risky, you can have a clear path to a data set that gives you more conviction that is actually worth putting cash in. So that, for us, is something that's completely fundamental for very early stage investors or investments. And there needs to be a coherent, credible plan. And as I said, the biology, the models, the path to clinic is really important. And so often we see plans that have found a target and you've got very elaborate mechanism where they're going to work out how to block it or agonize it or do whatever with no thought about, so what? How do you take it from there to actually get into patients and do something clinically? So I would like to see a coherent plan that goes from the insight through to the patient, which is mostly missing. And that's, from our perspective, we wouldn't fund it if it's not there. So it's not really a pitfall, but as you're putting your plans together, that's what you need to think about.
Yeah, there's also one other thing, I think we haven't actually said it, is that the best deals that when I look at what the sources of deals that we actually do, they're almost all referrals.
Yeah.
So cold emails, they always go straight in the bin. I now, I hesitate on clicking the delete button without actually reading a little bit of it, but the surrogate marker is I think there's one deal that we've done in 12 years that's come in as a cold.
Yeah.
The majority, the conversion rate for things that have come in from people that we trust in our network. And actually, the interesting thing is, so it sort of fits on, the deal that Kate was talking about, the Impact Bioscience deal that we did, is in San Diego deal, so we're not actually a local VC. So we did a deal in San Diego, and we got into that because of a person we know, it's actually Charlie McDermott, who used to work at Allergan, he used to be their business officer. So Charlie we knew very well, and we trusted him implicitly, said, you need to come and have a look at this deal. The guy who developed the drug really knew what he was doing. He'd actually invented the thing. It had got blocked. He'd sold it to Sanofi. It had got blocked, right? And he went in. He heard patients were dying, so he went back in and pulled it out. We were the only institutional investor because it didn't need that much cash to try and repatriate the molecule. But that actually had all the ingredients of, and then we got a great exit, okay? But it had all the ingredients there. It had somebody who really strong domain expertise, right? Don't ask this guy anything about this drug unless you want a really long answer, because he knows everything about it and the area. So, domain expertise, tick. It's been referred to us by somebody that we know and trust, tick, right? It's a really interesting investment model because it's effectively, it's an arbitrage opportunity. It's a molecule that's already been developed, it's got stuck, he's brought it back out, and now we're effectively restarting it. So the investment model looks really good. And then the fact that it's 5,000 or whatever, 8,000 miles away, doesn't matter. We'll go out and we'll go and get it. I think that's those are the ingredients. You get and the thing is that we saw this, and within 5 minutes we'd worked out we wanted to do it.
Thank you very much for being on panel today. Actually, I have 3-part question. So first one is, how to determine what amount of funding do you require, and how to price your equity before IPO, and can you negotiate with investors for what they are giving you and what they want?
Do you want to do this one, Kate, or me?
Okay, so I go back to the question. Don't think about pricing the equity at this stage. If you've got a good opportunity, there will be a sensible deal that will be agreed. That should not be your attitude going in. Your view going in should be all about what is, and actually you should be defining how much cash you need to get to those critical value inflection points. It's not for us to say, well, we think it's X. You should be the expert, so you should be saying, this is the amount we need to achieve these different milestones, and this is why. You should be thinking about who is the investor that will help you the most to achieve those milestones. So don't get into the, what's the share price. You're not going to end up in control. In these businesses, in therapeutics, you'll never end up in control. They absorb far too much cash. So the whole concept of control at this stage is bollocks. You need to think about what is the plan you want to deliver, how you're going to do that, and who are the best investors to help you. When you get ultimately to IPO, which will be somewhere down the line, because you have to have some data, and almost certainly you have to have clinical data. There are some examples where you can go public on preclinical, but by and large, you're much better off to have a solid clinical data set before you go out to the markets, because you'll get a strong valuation and you'll get better support, because investors can then see with clinical data, they can then see that path to registration and then obviously commercial launch, and that's what they are focused on. So again, I would just take the whole concept of valuation out of your views, because I don't know about you, but we wouldn't invest in a company if there wasn't a decent management ownership. And for managers, in the hypothetical example where VCs don't give management a decent ownership, that for us is a sign of bad management, because it means that they're willing to accept a non-market-based deal. So you need to think about developing the best possible business plan and get deal side of it out of your head.
And can I add to that? There are a number of deals that get shopped around. Right? This is a really bad surrogate market. So you could say, I want to get the best deal, so I'm going to shop it around and make it competitive. Sometimes works like that. Most of the time, it's a bad surrogate, because if it's that good, the first couple of people you show it to, somebody is going to bite, right? And then you'll put it around it. If it's going to go as far as IPO, your founder equity will be crushed to hell by the time you're pre-IPO. So it's not worth making that your battleground, at least not in my experience anyway. I mean, sometimes you can keep the founder equity really high, but only, you've got to take it a long way before that happens. Most of the time, it's not going to happen. So by the time you're on a Series C or something like that, it'll be crushed to nothing.
Let me just put some numbers around it. It typically takes about $50 million to get to the clinic. Also, I mean, plus or minus, and it depends where you start and the kind of format and so on. To actually get decent clinical data on average will probably cost $100 million upwards. So the sorts of companies you see going public on NASDAQ, which is where they mostly go public, will have raised that amount of cash. So Kevin's exactly right. No point having a fight over the ownership right at the beginning, because if you continue to add value, you will be rewarded for it. If you don't,
it's the share options or the growth shares or whatever that become the important part for you personally, as the package generally. That's the general rule anyway. And the other thing is that I don't just want this company that you're doing, I want your next one as well. So I'm not going to screw you over. I mean, some people do, but I'm not going to screw you over because I actually want your next company. And if I've screwed you over the first time, you're never coming back. And there are VCs who've screwed me over. I will never show them anything. Right? I'd rather eat the shares
And I'll give you another example. So we backed entrepreneurs. They were very successful. They came back with their next deal. And typically, we would give 15% ESOP, so employee stock option pool, which is sort of standard. These guys have made us money, so I topped it up to 20-odd% ESOP plus founders shares. Within half an hour, I sent a cap table and said, this is what I think it could look like, and because we'd agreed how much we thought they needed to raise and so on. Within half an hour, I get an email back that says, looks fine. And that was exactly that, which is they'd been good for us, we'd been good for them. We gave them more than would have been usual for the first time out, but it was perfectly reasonable second time out. No point arguing because that was a fair deal.
To give you some very rough figures, especially in the non-therapeutic, I'm not an expert on therapeutics. Typically, if you go out and raise a fund, you ought to think about giving up a quarter to a third of your equity in a funding round, because you'll have a few funding rounds. And then long term, as Kate said, we typically set aside 20% of share option pool, so that in the fullness of time, if there was substantial amounts of money that went into it, the ratio between the management and the investors is 20% to 80%.
Okay, great.
But very roughly, of course, with big variations depending on the deal.
All right. And we are out of time, unfortunately, but let's give our panelists a round of applause.